Hi, my name's Sandy Scott and I'm going to teach you today about memory. Your memory is where you store information that can be accessed at a later date. One model for describing how information is stored in your memory is the information processing model. In the first stage of the information processing model, the input stage, is where we first come in contact with the information. This stage occurs in your sensory memory, which is the temporary store of information that all your senses take in. Within your sensory memory, you have iconic memory and you have echoic memory. These are the two most studied senses. Iconic memory is memory for what you see, and echoic memory is memory for what you hear. From all of the information that our senses pick up, we pay attention to only a certain amount of it that will begin to be processed in our working memory. Working memory or short-term memory is what you're currently thinking about. In this memory, you can hold up to seven or around seven pieces of information, plus or minus two. So between 5 and 9 pieces of information in your working memory. Your working memory is also split up into sections: the visuospatial sketchpad, which is where visual and spatial information is processed, and you also have the phonological loop, which is where verbal information is processed. Once information is processed in the working memory, it can then be passed along to your long-term memory. Your long-term memory storage is the final stage of the information processing model. It can be split up into explicit memory and implicit memory. Information that is stored in the explicit memory is stuff like facts and events that you can clearly describe. Implicit memory, however, is stuff that's stored like riding a bike or learning to drive. You know, stuff that's hard to describe, but you don't really forget how to perform it. Now that we know a little bit about how information is processed, let's talk about encoding strategies. So these are techniques to help information move from your working memory to your long-term memory. One of the techniques is called role rehearsal, which is where you say something over and over to encode it in your long-term memory. This is not a very effective encoding strategy. There are more effective encoding strategies out there, which I'll discuss just now. Another technique is called chunking, which is where you lump information together into categories in your memory that become easier to remember. For example, if you have 15 items to remember on a grocery list, it might be easier to put them into categories such as vegetables, candy, sauces, etc. Be easier to remember those categories to then recall the information. This is a much more effective strategy than role rehearsal is. Another strategy would be to use mnemonic devices. This is a memory aid that helps you link the information you're attempting to learn into already learned material. Imagery is an example of this, where you might creatively imagine a picture in your mind to help you learn the material. The more creative or crazy the image or picture you're thinking of, the easier it generally is to remember the information. Another example is the peg word system, where you can rhyme words with numbers to help you recall the information you want to learn. So 1 bun, 2 shoe, 3 tree, that kind of thing. And you can link that to the material you want to learn. Another strategy is the acronym. This is where you will use each letter of a chosen word to help you link the information you desire to learn to the word. So if you're looking to remember how to, well, this is an example I use, know the directions on a compass. You have N, E, S, and W, of which I create the word never eat shredded wheat, which is probably not true, but anyways, that's how I remember the directions on a compass. And the last encoding strategy I'll talk about is spacing, and there's been some studies on this that say spacing your study sessions rather than cramming into one long session is more effective. This way you're able to understand what you don't know from each session so that you can plan your studying for your test in future sessions. Now that we're able to store information successfully in our long-term memory, it's important that we know how to retrieve that information. There are a number of retrieval cues that can help us access stored information. A lot of retrieval has to do with your process of encoding. So one cue is context, which says that you'll be able to retrieve information better if you are in a similar environment as to the one that you initially encoded the information in. State-dependent memory is another retrieval cue. This refers to your mood and your feelings. So when you're sad, for example, you're more likely to remember when you were last sad, or remember what things make you upset. Another example is if you are intoxicated, you might recall information better when you were last intoxicated rather than if you were sober. But obviously it is better to be sober when you were learning. Memory is a huge part of learning motor skills. To explain how memory is involved, I'll talk about an example such as learning how to draw a circle. So we'll use our touch to feel the pencil and paper and get comfortable with it, and use our sight to see them, and these things will be processed in our sensory memory, or the first stage of the information processing model, the input stage. The image of the circle will presumably be in your long-term stored in your long-term memory at this point, so we can retrieve that image of knowing what a circle looks like to try and draw it. Your first attempt at drawing a circle might be a little wonky, but we can learn from it. We can store the sensory information, such as how it felt and what it looked like, so that we know how to fine-tune our actions for future attempts. And the motor skill of drawing a circle can be stored in our long-term memory for future use, so we can retrieve it. Drawing a circle is probably more of an implicit memory, as it can be remembered for a long time without having much thought about it. So thank you very much for listening to my lecture on memory. I hope you learned something. So thank you for listening. See you later, guys.